Hi, I'm Tammy Falk from Sparks, Nevada, and this is Alice Taylor Elementary School, and we teach first grade.
My name is Ryan Doetch, and I'm a first grade teacher with my team partner here, Tammy Falk, and we're from Reno, Nevada.
You want to give me a little bit on the lesson? What did we teach today?
Okay. So today's lesson covered a close read in a read aloud format for first grade so that they had exposure to the text numerous times. And then we were working on figurative language, and then we broke into small groups to work on the author's purpose of writing the story, and then Mr. Doetch worked at his group.
Working on phonemic awareness and then word study, and then we looking at vocabulary to see if it was defined by the text or if it was defined by the picture then.
Okay. So moving on to the questions, we want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. First questions. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge, what was taught before the lesson, and what will come after it?
So prior to today's lesson, we worked on the same text, Al Moon, and we did various skills, just comprehension, working into story sequence, and they had that read aloud to them the first time just straight through to enjoy the story, and then we read it a second day asking specific questions, and then again moved on today to that figurative language.
And it's been a sequence over time too, because we started the original year looking at the major differences between a nonfiction and a fiction book. And then we moved into looking at telling the story if it has a beginning, middle, and end, and then first, next, and then the sequence of that. And then we moved into that characters have problems, and now we're at the point where we're trying to actually have students infer and looking at deeper parts of the text and then trying to find sources from the text.
Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
The close read was a standalone text. We did focus on the figurative language, and then we're looking for a close read in 2 weeks that will have a similar amount of figurative language. So we keep working on that inferring skill with them.
And then we did spend some time then too looking at nonfiction text, and we actually had one of our local animal shelters actually brought an owl out. And so the kids were actually able to see an owl in real life and they were able to refer back to it. And that really helped with our lesson too, because then they had prior knowledge and actually got to see the scientific part of it. So when we're actually doing the read aloud of it then, it was easier to connect the vocabulary then into the nonfiction and fiction text.
Talk about the standards targeted in the lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
Get a second on that one.
So mark on this.
Yeah.
Which ones we did? We did R1. It's literature.
Yeah, RL1.
R1.
R1, RL2.
R2. R10. Okay, we can go with those.
And go reading first.
Yep.
Okay. Looking at reading literature standards for first grade, we targeted ask and answer questions about key details in a text. We're working again on that close read of them showing the evidence from how did they know that, not just, I just know. They have to tell specifically from the text where they got their information. Retelling the stories in key details, again, we worked on that at small group when they had to talk about what the little girl learned from going owling, and they had to go back into the text to show how they knew that she learned that lesson. And then looking at the reading prose and let me back up. Looking at reading prose and poetry, a lot of the language in Al Moon is very poetic, and it has a lot of that, again, figurative language where they have to use some of the information from the illustration and from the text to be able to understand what's happening in the story.
And then we sequenced too because we were trying to look at what we could do to incorporate more of the standards in. And our focus before was looking at the reading informational text, and we spent a lot of focus on there. So using the same type of theme, which was owls then, we were trying to go into the reading literature then, and that's where we spent a lot of our time focusing on the reading literature standards then. And then because of the standards are so well, they work so well together and there's so many connections that we also incorporated the speaking and listening standards as well. The students were speaking to one another, and we've learned too through the Common Core is that students engage better and they have deeper understandings when they're the ones communicating and talking with each other then. And during our lesson, we actually had students, they were sharing and agreeing and disagreeing, but they were able to converse and talk about why they were disagreeing. And that was able to further our lesson along. And so it was a great tie into the SL standards then.
And again, looking at that student engagement piece, trying to ensure that all students are held to attending to the lesson. So as they're speaking with each other, there's that accountability one-to-one. And we're still seeing that we have children at different levels as far as being able to say, I agree because, I just respectfully disagree because. So that's something we're working on throughout the year, but that's part of that accountable talk that our school is working on kindergarten through 6th grade.
And then as we're planning the lessons, then the next thing we're going to incorporate too is the writing component. So when students were doing the daily 5 then, which is basically one component is students go and share their writing then. Some students were doing written text about what they learned from the information, and some were doing written responses then based upon what they heard in the story then.
Go to speaking, listening, writing. Writing real quick. Handwriting. 1.8. Okay. And then going with the writing standard that we were focusing on, again, we're asking the students to verbally tell us, well, how do you know that's happening? What part of the text was that? How did that person feel? All those pieces, and they have to go back into the text. We're now moving that to a writing component. So they tell us in this instance, what they thought the little girl had learned, and then they had to show from the text, how do you know that that's something she learned?
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
Okay.
All of them got the last one.
Yeah. Okay. So, you go home one more time. The students were either writing about text, some students were writing about vocabulary from the previous science lesson on owls. They read to self for fluency practice. They read to a partner. The majority of the books for Read to Partner are nonfiction, so we really work to get a balance of fiction and nonfiction. And we've seen such a high interest in the children when we do incorporate that nonfiction, where they'll struggle through decoding a word because they're really excited to read that text.
And so in Core Action 1, then, we spent a lot of time in having the students actually building then their knowledge through rich text. And so we did spend our previous lessons before this one today looking at experiencing nonfiction text. And they were just showing that to the students and also in the fiction side. And then we were also looking at basically reading and writing and speaking then, and we had evidence then supported through the text then. So in Core Action 1, Indicator B then, we actually have a complexity of text in because the text that we selected was actually considered a grade level text then. And the students then, this is now the 4th time they've heard the story and then they've read the story. And then Core Action C then, the students are looking at providing information then and looking at the illustration then to provide answers. And then throughout the previous lessons and today, then we asked them to define their answer. Where do you see that in the text? And can you give us an answer based upon what the text says? Or if the student did give us an answer, we saw several times this week where a student would give us an answer, but then we'd say, can you show us where does it say that in the text then? And the students would realize they had to change their answer then to make sure that it was supported within the text and or supported with the picture then. And that's when we saw students using the higher level skills of inferring and the reasoning of others then.
Just covered Core Action 2. Good job.
Okay.
Okay.
Be specific, don't go through and just
Okay.
we actually did do those.
Okay. So Core Action 2 again. Okay.
So we felt like we were really strong then in Core Action 2 as well. Because Core Action 2 has us employing questions in to get students engaged and getting them talking with one another. For instance, Core Action 2A was questions and tasks that address students to basically connect their ideas and concepts. One of the best strategies we've learned with that is A/B partnering then, because that engages every student then in the conversation. Whereas before we used to be just turn to your neighbor and talk, and now we specifically say A partner tell B partner, and then B partner come back and tell your A partner if you agree or disagree. And then we rotate that. That way every student gets the opportunity to engage in the conversation, and then every student is actually engaged into thinking about the text then. So no student is just sitting there doing nothing then.
And looking again at Core Action 2, really focusing in on when a child gives an answer, the follow-up question from us is always, how do you know? So they have to give a specific reason. Is it from the illustration? Is it from the text? Sometimes it's, I know this because this happened to me, so sometimes it's a personal connection, but they have to give a specific reason tied to either the text or the illustration.
And then Core Action 2, Indicator C, then using the correct vocabulary and questioning with them. And anytime the student gave the answer to us then, again, it was using the vocabulary that was embedded within the text then. And we actually had to spend some time then prior to teaching the lesson was identifying the vocabulary and making sure that the students knew what it was. And we actually did a couple lessons too, where we actually went through and defined vocabulary that kids think they need to know, and the vocabulary we thought they need to know to be able to read this story then.
Correction 3. Okay. Okay. So looking at core action 3, especially with the students persevering to find their answers, there wasn't a time when we were teaching that we would allow a student to just not answer. We would scaffold that and give them support. Sometimes it was listen to another student answer and then see if their thoughts match that. And in one of the instances, we had AJ who did not want to answer. He just couldn't verbalize it, but we gave him time to think and then had another student answer. Then when he was able to respond, he had a much higher level answer than anyone else had offered at that time. So again, holding them accountable, yes, you do have to answer. And then we use stick picks also to make sure all the students are engaged, so they're not sure who's next to be called on. So we don't just wait for them. They'll raise their hands because it's part of their habits, but we use the stick picks in general to make sure everybody's held accountable for answers.
And one thing that Core Action 3 has helped us do too, since the implementation of Core, is increasing our wait time for students, especially in first grade. Because we used to be really good about giving a question and expecting students to answer, and we would wait 1 or 3 seconds then. And now we've increased, because of Core Action 3 then, we've increased our time to 10 seconds or more. And we've noticed since we've implemented Core Action 3 with the wait time, we're getting more students engaged. And usually by the 8th second or the 10th second, you're going to see in our classroom then more and more hands are being raised. And sometimes too, we've learned, you know what, sometimes we have to wait beyond 10 seconds. And it's funny too, because when we first started doing it, what we thought was 10 seconds was only 4 or 5 seconds. So we've had to get into a condition of checking the clock, watching the clock, or counting internally just to make sure that we are hitting the 10 seconds. Because again, because of the waiting time and increasing that, we're engaging more of our learners then.
It's a skill that definitely takes some time, and so you do have to plan to change that in your teaching. And looking at what students, Core Action 3C, letting the students engage in literacy independently. Each of the students has a book bin, and during the read to self, they're going to be practicing the books at their level. So they have an anthology that has on grade level text. Then they have leveled readers that are at their developmental level. So we give them the opportunity for some success, and then again, giving them the on grade level text to have them stretch and show all those strategies independently. All right. Correction 4, foundational skills. We're going to talk about those. 4A. Foundational skills.
So to really help with Core Action 4 then first grade, one thing we had to do was break into smaller groups then. And so during our guided reading groups, one of the first things that I was working on my table is students who were working on foundational skills and being able to decode words. And so they were taking and making words based upon letters then, and then putting the letters back together, and then making sure they had a strategy that they were comfortable when they get to a word they don't know. And the strategy that some of them used in my table was the stretch, blend, and read method, where they stretch out the word, then they blend it, and then they read it back together. Other students were looking at piecing up or breaking up the word. Are there chunks and sounds in there I know? And then reading it back together then. And then what was great is that it's a strategy we've been implementing since the beginning of the year because of Core Action 4. All the students have efficient strategies then which they can use when they get to a word they don't know.
And even in my small group doing a response to the close read, they were doing some writing. So we had to look at those foundational skills of capitalization, punctuation, the writing process. They were able to go back and read out loud what they wrote to see, does it make sense? And then they were able to self-correct.
And then Core Action B in my group then too, with my group, that my second rotation was I had kids working on vocabulary and trying to find words that they didn't know. And again, this group is very familiar with the foundational skills, and they're very comfortable. And so looking at vocabulary, that was something I'd like to do over again though, just because when I got to the word interesting, the kids already knew the word, and I was trying to figure out what strategy they used to decode the word. But since they already had the knowledge of the word then, they kept trying to find other words that they wanted to decode. And I kept trying to focus on just the word interesting. And if I could do this lesson over again, that'd be one component I would do with that group was, you guys already know this word, you have a strategy, so let's move on to another word and focus more on the vocabulary and then where the vocabulary came from.
the first reading group I had, I would rescaffold that lesson. They had a different graphic organizer for their writing, but so much of our time was spent on those foundational skills, separating the phonemes, which letters make these sounds, that concept of print with the spaces between the words. So in looking at that again, we would do a shared writing, and then for both of those responses. Because they weren't ready to do that independently. Again, we spent so much time on foundational skills, we didn't get to the answer to the question and finding support from the text.
And then part of Core Action 4 too is that students have to systematically, basically master foundational skills. And we do 5 different rotations in here, where the first one is read to self, and where students will just go to read to self. They've got materials they can read as my team partner here shared. And the second one they do is read to partner. So students go, they read to partner, and they get to practice those skills, one, listening to another fluent reader, and then reading that back to another person then. And the third one we engage into is listening center. So they actually get to listen to a CD, or they get to listen to an iPad where the story is being read to them, where they can track and follow the words. And they can actually hear and practice what does it sound like to listen to a fluent reader. And then the fourth one then is writing.
Writing, and today's writing was a response. We had a graphic organizer in response to a pictorial we did on the great horned owl. And they had to show one thing they already knew. We did that prior to doing the pictorial lesson. And then they had to write for today, there are 3 things they learned. And then we were actually working on the text component of diagram. So they had to draw a diagram. Many of them drew an illustration, so we're going to have to pull a small group tomorrow and talk about the difference between an illustration and a diagram. So that's going to be the next component of that.
And then our 5th rotation was word work. That's where students actually were taking iPads. And we pre-programmed the iPads, that words that they had worked on last week in their phonics and their phonemic awareness parts. We actually were able to put those in the iPad where the students were given the word read by the teacher, and they had to go back and reconstruct the word then based upon their understanding of the word and the knowledge we built from the previous lessons then. And so then when we put all those 5 together, then we have a balanced reading group. And then the students then are also going to guided reading groups where they come see the teachers for different skills and for different ways to work with the text.
I think we covered those.
We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instructions. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay. One of the biggest shifts we made in our literacy instruction was, again, that balance of fiction and nonfiction, looking at not just retelling a story, but actually going into a text to learn from the text. So we have given the children lots of opportunities to have leveled readers in guided reading groups that are nonfiction as well as fiction. And we're right in the middle of working on comparing what does a fiction text look like, what is a nonfiction text, and how are their purposes the same and different.
Another shift we've done quite a bit too is taking anecdotal notes of the students then and taking explicit notes on the students based upon, we take notes then what the student response is. If they were able to answer a question, were they able to respond right away? Did they need more think time? And then how in-depth was their answer? And if their answer we would require then more conversations or connecting to another student. And so that's been a huge shift, as well as then more of a formative assessment size where we're observing and watching then and asking more questions where, again, they're conversing through the text or conversing through the answers, and they're doing a lot more sharing with each other as well.
And then looking at having them being able to show evidence from the text. That's something that we really had to sit down and go, okay, well, we have them give the answer. We've done that for years. But now we need to say, how do you know that? Where from the text did you find that? So we got a lot at first of, well, my brain just told me. Well, that's not, you have to go into the text and give a specific example, whether it's from the text or whether it's from the illustration. So, and that's still in progress. That's not something we work on daily with them.
And the other big shift that we have too is letting students explain their answers. And it was very evident during my group because the vocabulary was careful. And the students came up with careful, and they were trying to define it based on the text. And one student was actually using the picture, and he says, you know what, here's an example of what careful looks like. We're in the forest, and there's a sign that says today's burning level is moderate. And he goes, that's why we had to be careful, because if the level was red, he goes, we wouldn't be able to do that. So he made the connection to careful. And next thing you know, my entire group then, they were all making connections to other things you have to do careful. And before we just asked him, do you know what careful is, yes or no? But now we're going back and scaffolding and saying, well, how do you know what careful is? And he was going back in the text and saying, well, I used the picture as an example to help me define what that word was. And that's been another big shift.
How do you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so that they can read grade level text?
One of the scaffolds we have is placement on the carpet during the close read of the read aloud. We worked very hard to make sure that we had students of different ability levels next to each other. So you have an A partner and a B partner that can support each other. So you might have someone who needs that model for the verbal response, or you might need someone who needs a model of how to listen to someone else speaking. So that is one of the places we do that. The other place that we focused in on this lesson was when we came to my table for the writing part, there are two different graphic organizers. One that was purely for written response, and one that had written response with an illustration part. Again, that piece was a little bit too far for that group, but because we kept focusing on the foundational skills. The other part where we scaffold for those students is the developmental leveled readers that are in their book boxes. So they have that opportunity to read on grade level text and then have some fluency practice with leveled readers on their independent reading level.
And then during our read aloud, just to help more students then engage into the text and the pictures, we were very fortunate we're able to have an interactive whiteboard, and we're actually able to project the book up onto the board. So the students could actually see the text in and follow along, and they could see the pictures when they're describing. Versus if we just held the book up, we're only showing part of the students then. And so you saw my team partner here, she had the book, she was holding it, but then they could also see it on the board, and they had a very good understanding and a good visual cue of what was going on. And then during my groups then too, I had some students who were using the iPads then because they were 21st century learners then. And then I had some kids who needed the tactile part of the letter then, so that I put them on magnetic boards then, and they were able to interact with the letters then.
Continuing on this question, how did you create opportunities for students who are more advanced to engage more deeply with the grade level text?
The second group that I had is our students that do need enrichment. So in looking at how they were to respond, both of their sections were written, because for them to do an illustration is not a stretch for them. So we looked at making sure that they were able to write what the little girl learned from the book, from going owling with her paw, and then also they were able to write then how they knew. And so instead of drawing an illustration for them, it was a writing component.
And then when we were doing the vocabulary at my table then, for the kids who were getting the vocabulary quite quickly, they had to actually go back in the text and say, okay, where was the text, or what was the vocabulary defined in there? Was it through the text then, or was it through the actual pictures? And they had to explain their thinking on there, and then they had to make a connection. And with my group who was working with the WordWork students then, those students were able to make connections very quickly then. They had to think about, well, could I use it in a sentence then? Or where other words make the same sound, or what other patterns also incorporate the same letter types then?
And then again, looking at their writing that they were doing independently, we have the same base expectation for all of our students based on the standards. But then our students that need that challenge, we look at the expectations for the next grade level, and they know that that is their expectation because they've already met the first grade standard at this time.
How do you know that the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
We listened in as the students were sharing with their neighbor to be able to see, were they giving a specific answer? Were they supporting it from the text? Were they able to agree or disagree respectfully with that person and give a specific example from that? During the writing time, I was able to look at the first group that I had and notice that, again, we were focusing so much on the foundational skills that the writing piece of it was slipping from the instruction. So that's a group I need to revisit and do a shared writing with what they learned.
And then when the students were doing the closed reading then, and where my team partner was reading the story then, I actually had my iPad where I was taking notes then. Students were conversing and sharing with one another, and then what their answers was. And I started on the side of the room, and then as we got to the second question, I tried to move around the room then on this side to make sure everyone was talking with a partner. And then I wrote down what they were talking about then. So I'm able to go back to my notes later then and say, okay, what specifically was the students saying and who are they talking to? And it was great then because all the notes I had so far was everybody was talking to their neighbor about the topic or the question that was being asked to them. And then the students, every single student was sharing if they agree or disagree, but then they were giving reasons why they agree or disagree. And then what we try to do in our groups then, I know that during our group, one student specifically said he disagreed with a student. He was able to share why. The student he disagreed with was able to defend his answer, and that changed the opinion of the student who disagreed. And he changed his mind and said, you know what, actually I do agree with what you're saying because of that conversation. And I think because we have all of our students sharing then, and that's the expectation here that they will be sharing, it opens up that whole communication connection of, well, I disagree, but now I do agree because of your reasoning, or vice versa. I agree, but now I disagree because of the reasoning you gave me then.
Which behaviors from core action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson?
Get our specifics. Core action 3. Okay. I would say for this lesson in core action 3, one of the best evidence of that was when the students were discussing on the carpet and defending each other's answers, again, like Mr. Doetch was talking about at his table, if they agreed or if they disagreed, and giving that specific evidence from the text as to why they agree or why they respectfully disagree.
Another one they exemplified quite a bit was revoicing it. A couple students, we couldn't hear what they were saying then. So instead of having one student just share their answer again, though, to make sure that we engaged all the learners then and exemplify that lesson, we picked another student who was sitting somewhat close and having them revoice what they said. And that focuses in and says, were you specifically paying attention? And 2, do you understand what the message was? And then if the student wasn't able to revoice him, we go back to the original student, having them sharing them one more time, and then say, could you revoice it again? That, again, building the conversations, but again, it kind of forces the students to pay attention, but it also makes them, make connection to the learning then without doing it in a threatening way then. We had them all, let's just make sure.
Yeah. And we already talked about the independence.
Okay.
We talked about that piece.
Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently?
Looking at Al Moon as our anchor text for the read aloud, as far as a close read, I was honestly surprised that within the second read, I was able to ask questions and they were able to give answers that I hadn't expected. And I think that was an example for me of really teaching the core. They surprise us that they can actually do this when we focus in and expect that they will at least attempt some of these skills.
One thing I thought went really well too was when the overarching question was, what was the message from the author? What did we learn? And by the end of the story, then all the students were making connections of what they learned. Well, I learned the author's message was, we have to be brave, or you have to have hope, or you have to have specific things when you go owling then. And that, he used different repetition in different parts of the story then to share that with us. And I thought that went extremely well.
Last question.
Okay.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors?
I think the one surprise for me was when I had a group that was supposed to be doing a written response. That was my standard that I wanted them to work on, was being able to write what lesson the little girl had learned. And they weren't at that place. They could verbalize the lesson, but the actual writing of it, there's some foundational skills that we need to work on first before they're able to express that.
I didn't see any negative behaviors whatsoever because they were all engaged the entire time. And then the only reactions I saw that they connected to the core or connected to the story was a positive one. And then when they were in the rotations in reading groups then, again, the reaction was that this is something they're very familiar with in the routine we've set up since the beginning of the year. They know what's expected because that is the expectation of the classroom, and we've maintained that theme throughout the year. So I didn't see any unexpected behaviors. And then it was great to see too that while we're doing guided reading groups, as we were scanning the room, then all the students then were completely engaged in doing what they were supposed to be doing. What I would like to have done, that one thing we didn't get the time to do, was to tie back in. What did you do to go back into the lesson, or what did you do then to tie back into the overarching question? So one of the first things we're going to do tomorrow, then we come back, is what was the overarching question, and then what was your response to it? Did you make an adequate progress? Were you able to define what the answer was? Were you able to make connections to the question? And that's where we'll begin our lesson with tomorrow then.
One of my surprises when I was doing the close read was when they was talking about the echo threading through the trees. When planning that lesson, we had anticipated using a needle and thread to show them physically what threading looked like, and then using students and have them thread through each other. And we didn't need that scaffolding for them. So that was a surprise that was grasped so quickly without those scaffolds and physical models in place.
That's it.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.